Hereby, I open the academic ceremony in which Thales Bertaglia will defend his academic thesis titled Decoding Digital Influence, Computational Insights into Monetization, Controversy, and Compliance in the Creator Economy. Dear candidate, may I invite you to present a summary of your study and the conclusions of your thesis.
Thank you. Dear Prorector, dear members of the Defense Committee, family, friends, everyone online, I'm really happy to see you all here. Every morning, many of us wake up, pick up our phones, and start scrolling our social media feeds on apps like Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. People spend on average more than 2 hours on social media every day. That's a lot. So it's clear that social media is very important to our lives nowadays. It shapes the ways we interact with each other, consume information, and make decisions. And at the heart of social media today are influencers, content creators who share their lives online and reach millions of people. Influencers are seen as relatable, authentic, and trustworthy. And many of their followers even perceive them as friends. So this combination of deep relationships and massive audiences gives them real power. Power to influence what we buy, what we care about, and even what we think. And of course, this influence can be turned into profit. So this is content monetization, when influencers use their content to promote brands, services, or ideas. And this is the central point of the creator economy, an ecosystem that involves multiple stakeholders like social media platforms, influencers, brands, and all of us social media users. So this is when things start to get tricky. So influencers are seen as trustworthy. But what happens when they start to mix their personal opinions with paid partnerships? Then the line between authenticity, honesty, and advertisement starts to blur. So imagine you want to buy a new phone. So you go to YouTube and search for product reviews. Then you find a video of an influencer you really like. You watch it, and you're convinced that you want to buy that phone because the review was very positive. But then you start reading the comment section, and turns out that influencer had a paid partnership with the brand, and they didn't disclose it. So then you start to wonder, were they saying all those good things because it was their honest opinion, or was it because they were paid to do so? So this is when trust starts to break. So not saying that an ad is a form of misleading consumers. Not only it breaks trust, it even can break the law. And another significant issue within the creator economy and social media in general is toxicity. So social media platforms are full of harassment, hate speech, and personal attacks. And influencers have to deal with this sort of content all the time. And even their behavior can encourage people to be toxic as well. So this turns social media platforms into worse environments for everyone. And this is another legal and ethical issue. And governments all around the world are concerned about the creator economy and are trying to come up with ways, including rules, regulation, laws, to make the creator economy into a more transparent and safer place. The problem is, however, that in practice, the scale of the creator economy is massive. Millions of posts are created every day. So even if there are rules in place, how can enforcers and authorities make sure that influencers follow them? So this is where my research comes in. So I develop machine learning models, data resources, and methodologies that allow us to study and measure the creator economy. So in practice, I develop computational methods to help authorities, enforcers, researchers, and society in general to study the creator economy and come up with ways to make it more transparent and safer. So in my thesis, I tackle two main issues: transparent advertising and toxicity. So we start with transparent advertising. So the first thing I do is propose methodologies that allow us to answer questions like how much advertising is there on social media, and most importantly, are influencers transparent with their advertising? So before I show my results, let me tell you a bit about ad disclosures. So basically, when an influencer creates a post that is sponsored, that was paid for, they are required to disclose it. So in this example here, we have the influencer promoting a coffee brand, and we can see that there are two disclosures. There's a hashtag ad, and there's also that tag on the top. So this is a disclosure. So this is telling their followers that this is clearly an ad. And disclosure requirements vary depending on countries. So for instance, Germany is very strict with disclosure requirements, and some influencers were even fined or taken into court for not disclosing, while other countries like Brazil, where I'm from, is more focused on self-regulation. So there are some guidelines, but they're not really enforced. So in chapter 2 of my thesis, I conduct a large-scale study to understand how influencers disclose or not disclose their ads. So I analyzed over 1 million Instagram posts by 400 influencers from 4 different countries, Brazil, Germany, the Netherlands, and the US, and I collected data from 2010 to 2022. So I first start analyzing disclosed ads, and the results are very interesting. So we can see here that German influencers had around 16% of disclosed ads, and is a much higher disclosure rate than all the other countries that are around 2%. So this already shows us a connection between stricter regulation and higher disclosure. But does this mean that German influencers are just better at monetizing their content? Do they just have more brand partnerships? Probably not. So what is likely to be happening here is that there are a lot of ads that are not disclosed, so they're not complying with regulation. So to understand that, I developed a machine learning model in which I use post captions that were clearly ads, so disclosed ads, to train the model and then classify my entire data set, the entire 1 million posts. So I train the model and then I apply it to the full data set, and then we can see the prevalence of ads in total, include undisclosed ones, and the results are striking. So the red bars here show the percentage of undisclosed ads, while the green bar is disclosed ads. So with the exception of Germany, the other countries have the majority of ads not disclosed. So they're not following the regulations. And the total proportion is very similar, so ranging from 14 to 20%. So the prevalence of ad is similar, but only German influencers disclose most of their ads. So again, we see a connection between regulation and transparency. So this result can be used by enforcement agencies to study the impact of disclosures and how they impact the practices of influencers. But then you might be wondering, how do we know that the model actually works? How do we know that when the model classifies something as an ad, it actually is an ad? So that's what I tackle in chapter 3 of my thesis. So I develop methodologies to ensure that we can have reliable ad detection. So the key point about machine learning here is that we need reliable data. So the way the model learns is it has examples of what an ad is, and then it learns patterns that it then applies to classifying unseen examples. So the key point is having this reliable data. And the way it works, we have annotators, so people who make the decision. They look at the post and they decide whether it's an ad or not. And the problem is that this is a very difficult task. So people disagree a lot. And disagreements means that their annotations is not reliable, and therefore data is not reliable. Therefore, the model cannot reliably learn how to do the task. So the key point here is to enable reliable decision-making by humans. So in chapter 3, I propose a methodology using generative AI, so LLMs like ChatGPT. So I use them to generate explanations to augment the annotation process. So instead of only the annotators having access to the post caption, like on my right here, I generate an explanation with ChatGPT and I add it to an annotation process. So the explanation can be something like this post is mentioning a brand, so it's likely sponsored. And then that's it. So it's a simple approach, but the results are very promising. So I achieve an improvement of almost 16% in agreement, which is basically data reliability in this context. And most importantly, most annotators feel more confident in their decision making. So this is an effective approach that can lead to more reliable data and then more reliable models. However, there's still another problem. Data scarcity. So for machine learning models, not only we need reliable data, we also need lots of data. And the problem is in this context is that undisclosed ads are inherently hard to come by because they're not disclosed, so we don't know they're ads. And the other issue is that social media platforms are very restrictive with data sharing for researchers, so it's very hard to access data. So I once again use LLMs, but this time to generate synthetic data. So I use ChatGPT to write fake Instagram captions. And I propose different strategies for generating data and also different metrics to evaluate data. So I have two main goals here. One is to generate captions that look like real Instagram posts and also that are helpful. They help improve machine learning model. So you can see an example here of a synthetic caption. So on an individual level, it looks quite realistic. It even generates brand tags, hashtags, uses emojis, and so on. And when we combine real data with synthetic data to train a machine learning model, it improves the results. So here we see an improve from 42% to 57% ad detection accuracy. So this is another promising approach to improving the task of ad detection. And now we move to a darker side of the creator economy. So as I said before, social media is full of toxicity and influencers face daily harassment and abuse. And toxicity makes social media worse for everyone. So on chapter 4, I start addressing this issue by defining it. So I propose a framework for defining abusive language inspired by legal definitions. So basically I take different laws from different countries and combine them into an annotation framework that then allows to annotate data reliably, which then can be used to train machine learning models for tagging, detecting toxic comments, and so on. So I use this this annotation framework, and law students labeled a data set of YouTube comments with more than 19,000 comments. And by analyzing this data set, we see that there's more than 11% of these comments were labeled as abusive. So there's a lot of toxicity on social media. And more interestingly, we noticed that many of these comments were targeting the gender of the content creator. So still in chapter 4, to further analyze the relationship between toxicity and gender, I conduct another study, this time analyzing different expressions of toxicity using machine learning models for detecting things like negative sentiment, offensive language, hate speech, and sexism. And then I evaluate how these features correlate with gender. So to do that, I collected a data set with 200,000 YouTube comments posted on videos by more than 100 YouTubers from different genders. And my results show that women receive more hateful and sexist comments, while men receive more toxic and offensive comments. And even on videos by male YouTubers, a lot of the comments were being toxic towards women. So we see that women face a lot of sexism online. So far I've been talking about influencers as the target of toxicity, but they can also be a source of toxicity. So in chapter 5, I investigate when influencers use toxicity as a strategy for getting engagement. So I collected a data set of 20 controversial YouTubers that are controversial on purpose to attract attention. And then I collected all their videos and over 100 million comments, and I analyzed the relationship between controversy, toxicity, engagement, and monetization. And I measure monetization by analyzing the video descriptions and finding URLs that contains like affiliate marketing links, links that are selling a product or promoting a brand. And then I analyze how all these features interact with each other. And my results show that controversy leads to more comments, so more engagement. However, this engagement tends to be negative, so it leads to more negative interactions. So these toxic videos tend to have fewer likes, less monetization, and a higher prevalence of toxicity. So at least in the short term, this is a strategy that does not benefit the creators. However, in the long term, considering that many of these channels have been around for long, it might work because they're still there. They still might attract an audience that resonates with their controversial and toxic content. So I would like to conclude by saying that we need more regulation, we need more and clearer rules. We also need computational methods like the ones I've been discussing here. But most importantly, we need interdisciplinarity. So we need to draw insights from law, social sciences, computer science, AI, to make sure that whatever solutions we are developing are actually addressing the needs of all stakeholders in the creator economy, especially the influencers themselves, because they're the ones most likely to be affected by regulation or every solution. Thank you, and now I give the word back to the prorector.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Before we proceed with the opposition, let me briefly introduce this committee to the audience. So on my opposite left, we have Professor Jamnitsky and Dr. Gwanza, who are the thesis supervisors. And next to them, we have Professor Tintarev. And on this side, on my far right, we have Dr. Zanetu, Dr. Nguyen, and next to me, Dr. Herma, who is the acting secretary of the degree committee. And online, we are accompanied by Professor Aletras and by Professor Weiss. Finally, my name is Duisman, and I'm representing our rector for this meeting. Now, in the next 45 minutes, questions will be asked by the members of the assessment committee, and the opposition will be opened online by Professor Weiss, who is a professor of AI and computer science at the Department of Advanced Computing Sciences at Maastricht University. Professor Weiss, the floor is yours.
The candidate, I enjoyed reading through your thesis, which covers a highly relevant topic. So I really enjoyed it. I have some basic questions related to the choices you made. So for instance, in chapter 2, that's my first question, you used 500K followers as a cutoff point to distinguish between mega and micro influencers. My question is why exactly 500K? If you would use, for instance, 400K or 300K as a cutoff point, wouldn't this mix up all your results, at least those presented in chapter 2?
Esteemed opponent, thank you for your question. It is a great question, and indeed, this definition of what is a micro and mega influencer is very complicated. And in practice, there's not a single definition, so there's not a standard of how to define that. There are different thresholds in the literature, but I think in the context of my work, I think this is very arbitrary. So whatever number we use doesn't really mean much, because I think for the number of followers is a very shallow metric that doesn't indicate the level of professionalization and activity of influencers. So it's just really a way to separate the groups of influencers. So my idea there was mostly, so for mega influencers, we sampled influencers with most followers in the country. So we use this influencer management tool to search online, because Instagram by itself doesn't have a way to search for accounts. So for mega influencers was basically the ones with the most followers. And then for micro influencers, I selected that threshold. And then I selected influencers that are very close to that threshold. So the sample is comparable within the group. So it's kind of a way to controlling all confounding factors. But yeah, it's just a number. Indeed, changing to a different threshold would change the results. But I argue that there's no ideal threshold. So it's always a decision.
I see. Do you think it would make sense to make a kind of more fine-grained distinction, for instance, between mega and micro influencers, but also nano or niche influencers? So to have two cutoff points, for instance, would that increase the insights you could get?
That's a good approach. The problem is in practice is finding the data. So when I conducted this study to collect the data, I used CrowdTangle, which was the official platform by Meta for collecting data from Instagram. And for instance, it only indexed influencers with a certain number of followers. I think was 100,000. So it wouldn't really be possible to find niche influencers. And also then finding those influencers using tools like the one I used, it's very complicated. So we had to, when curating this data set, we had to do it manually. We went through the accounts to make sure they fit our criteria. So on the one hand, while I think this is good, having finer grained categories definitely helps. I think the categories should be informed by more than a number of followers. So we should have an hypothesis, maybe for industry, for instance, like influencers that are on making content about fashion or about sports. I think these categories are more informative. So I think we need to move beyond shallow metrics like number of followers to deeper things that will actually give us more insight into their activities.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. In chapter 3, I have another question concerning the choices you made. So in chapter 3, you said you used 100 influencers from the US from your Instagram data set. So basically two questions. Why 100 influencers and not 150 or 120 or 80? And why only from the US and not from other countries like Brazil or Netherlands or Germany? So two questions basically.
So, thank you. So on chapter 3, I was using the same data set that I use on chapter 2. So it's the same influence data set with 400 influencers and 100 influencers from the US because that was my sample from the US. So I used all the data from the US. Why US and not all the other countries? It was a practical matter because we labeled some of the data that I used to evaluate the model. And I don't get into too much detail on the thesis, but this was an activity with law students from enrolled in a master's program in law and technology. And English was the language that everyone spoke. So in practice, we had a resource, like we had the students that volunteered to participate in this. So we could get labeled data for English. And we didn't have the resources to label data for more countries. But definitely this would be important, like to get a better estimate on how the model works with different languages, with influencers from different countries. But what I do in chapter 3, I use a multilingual BERT. And although I don't evaluate it directly on all the languages in my data set, we have evidence from the literature, from other tasks, that it does work for when it should be comparable, because we start from the pre-trained model and we fine-tune it on the data, and even though we don't evaluate it, it would work similarly, comparably.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah. Final question regarding chapter 4. So you use the abusive language on YouTube dataset, and which contains 20,000 comments labeled by law students. Do you know from what regions, US, Europe, or so, do the comments mostly come from? I think that might be of interest. And from what regions do the content creators targeted by these comments come from?
Yeah, so we don't have information about the demographic information, like about the author of the comments. But when curating the data set, I made sure that the majority of comments is in English. So I don't know exactly the country of origin, but we have some control over language at least. And same thing for the content creators. So they all posted majority in English, and came, most of them from the US, but some were from the UK, for instance, or Australia, but it's mostly US and mostly English. So that's what we know about the demographics.
Okay, yeah, thanks. That helps me understanding the choices you made. So that's it from my side for now. I give back to the prorector.
Thank you very much. Then the opposition will be continued online by Professor Aletras, who is a professor of natural language processing at the Computer Science Department of the University of Sheffield. Professor Aletras.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation, Thales. I really enjoyed reading your thesis, and I think it makes very good contributions in computational social science. And I really enjoyed not only for the technical thoroughness, but from the fact that it goes really deep on the social science aspect, and I really appreciate it, even if I'm a computer scientist by trade. I'm just going to ask you a couple of questions, and the first one is, I always ask these questions in PhD vivas. If you had to choose one of the most influential paper from the ones that you put it in your thesis, which one would you choose and why?
Sorry, can you repeat the question? It's a bit hard to hear in the room.
Maybe you can move a bit closer to the microphone. Thanks.
Can I repeat? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Right. So if you had to choose one of the most influential papers from your thesis, which one would you choose and why?
That's a great question. Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for the kind words and the question. So I think one of the one maybe that I liked the most was chapter 3.1 of the using LLMs to augment annotations, because I think it was a very simple approach. Like technically it's very simple and it was very effective. So I really like that because it can lead to more reliable data, and as I was saying in my presentation, that's the foundation of many of the things I'm doing. And it's simple. It can be, as I discussed on the thesis, what the annotators liked the most wasn't the reasoning. So the thing that I used, like chain of thought with ChatGPT for generating, what they liked the most was just highlighting the tokens. So saying like, oh, this is likely a brand, or this hashtag is likely an ad campaign. So it's something that we could even use simpler models. We wouldn't even need to use LLM. So even like a local explanation model like Lime could be helpful here. That would be very cheap computationally, and the results were impressive, I think. So I think I really liked that one. I don't know if it would be the top one, but that was the first one that came to my mind.
It's a good selection, actually, because that's relevant to my next question and related to chapter 3. I really like this hybrid approach of generating data with humans and then helping them with synthetic data generation from LLMs. Do you think that actually we could replace human annotators entirely for this particular task using LLMs?
That's a great question, and short answer, no, I don't think so. And I think I'm very critical in chapter 3, especially about the synthetic data. I think it can be helpful given the limitations, especially with, as I said, social media platforms limiting data access to researchers. But there are many limitations and many issues with synthetic data, and I highlight a few of them. So on a superficial level, I think models can indeed generate data and can be helpful in domains that we have very little data. So some specific industries or like local influencers, I think that can help, but I don't think it can replace real data or replace annotation. So now moving to 3.1, so the LLM for sponsored content detection, it's interesting because the results show that, for instance, ChatGPT got 80% F1 on detecting undisclosed ads, which is pretty high. But I think we need to be very careful when interpreting that result, because of the issue of data reliability. So the metrics are high, but since the annotations are not reliable, I don't think they tell us the whole story. So I think LLMs can replace the easy annotations, the ones that are clearly ads, but I think we still need this intervention to make sure that models are reliable. And I think if AI is good, it's even better when we use it as human-AI collaboration. So I don't see a future that we completely replace annotators.
Thanks. And the final question, as you said, the performance of these models for detecting undisclosed ads is quite high. How much can we trust them to use them in real-world applications, I don't know, from regulatory agencies, for example?
Yes. So what my experiments show is that in some of these results, I don't get into much detail in the thesis, but I did some error analysis and look through the classifications. And what I see happening is that the model is very good at picking up obvious patterns. So if there's a brand tagged and if there are hashtags that are related to marketing and so on, it works quite well. But then it tends to overestimate these things. So it can learn patterns that are indeed indication of sponsored content, but not always. So it fails on this, in these cases that are complicated. So even for people, for annotators. So how much we can trust them? I think for the majority of posts, we can trust them, but there's still a considerable amount that it's hard. But it's inherently hard just given how the task is framed. We're taking the caption of a post without any context and try to classify that. So I think that the limitation is more on the task itself, how I framed it, than the model. So it's more about context and, yeah.
Okay, that's all from my side. Thanks a lot, Thales.
Thank you very much. Then the opposition will be continued by Dr. Herma, who is an assistant professor at the Department of Advanced Computing Sciences at this university.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for your thesis. I enjoyed a lot reading it, and your presentation today was clarifying some of the missing points there. So let me start with observations in tables 3.1 and 4.7. Actually, in both cases, you have a binary classification task. But you decided to use the F1 score, which you compute separately from the positive and negative, and next to that, take also the macro F1, which is just the average of the two numbers. So why you decided to have this type of measurement of the performance of the model?
Esteemed opponent, thank you for the kind words and the question. So in this case here, we care a lot about the performance on the positive class, which in this context is add. That's why I also add accuracy on the disclosed, accuracy on detecting undisclosed adds. So I think the binary F1, so the per class F1, gives us more fine-grained insight, so we can see the performance of each class. And then macro F1, just the average, because I care about the performance for both classes. So we need a balance. We need to make sure that the model is correctly identifying adds, but it's not overestimating that. So I think the average gives us a big picture of the metrics. But it's very important to consider the accuracy on undisclosed adds. So I think taking the whole view gives us a real insight into the results.
Okay, so it is usually not used in a binary task, this type of measurement. The F1 score and some additional measures like false positives and false negatives often gives you more accurate picture. And actually, since you shared both of these numbers, I was able to compute back your confusion matrix. Mm-hmm. And I see that you have actually 302 false positives mm-hmm. in this best classifier that you have, which is quite high number. So this false positives, that is the model detects an text to be undisclosed add, while it's not, seems to be a big problem here. And then you tackle that problem in the annotation by adding explanations. And I was wondering that, to me, it sounds difficult to explain why something is not add versus why something is add.
Indeed. So about the false positive rate, I think that's a good observation. However, in this context, we're focusing more on undisclosed adds, so the true positive, so the accuracy. Mm. So I think given the context of this chapter, this was the most important measurement. And about the explanations, so the way I generated explanation, I think explanation is a weird word in this context. It's more additional context. Yep. So it's more about what makes this potentially an add. So it's not trying to explain why it's not an add. It's more like, because the goal was kind of...
But that's your main problem, that you have actually model predicting that things that are not adds are adds. So you want to solve that in your annotation, right? That you want to have more content where you have clear explanation why this is not an add. No, can you give an example of what is an explanation for not an add?
No, so in this case, so the explanations were focused on sponsored. So adding more context, why this might be sponsored. Yep. So in the case of a non-sponsored ad, it would be something like, this seems to be an authentic post or organic post. So there wouldn't be really an explanation. Yep. So what was helping there was highlighting the token. So like, oh, there's at beauty brand here. So, oh, this post is tagging a brand, so it's likely to be sponsored. Okay. So the focus was on this, not really on the non-sponsored.
Okay, so it could be like there is no tags in this post, therefore this is probably an authentic post. Mm. Yeah. Okay, good. I was wondering also, you use this uncased version of BERT model, which means that it's using content which is in lowercase. Mm-hmm. And if you have content which has commercial brand names and that type of things, they are often written with a capital letter first. So I was wondering why you wanted to make it so difficult for your model.
So I think on social media data, especially Instagram, although indeed brands, when written on the text, tend to be capitalized, when it's a tag, so either a user tag with the @ symbol or a hashtag, usually they're not capitalized. So these are the most important signals. So I think the uncased model made sense in this context, but it would be interesting to also check different models. But it wasn't so much about the model itself here, it was more about the methodology. So I didn't try that many models, but I think in this context, uncased was fine because the most tags would be lowercase
it's like a hashtag
anyway.
And name. So because hashtag has names, you don't have capital letters.
Yeah. Usually we don't have capital letters
Okay,
on
right.
social media.
Okay, interesting. So this whole influencer economy is a very complex thing, and there's like services like that are selling kind of a followers.
Yes.
And they're actually quite big businesses. People are using those a lot. So how do you feel that this actually influenced your results and your these real counts of the followers of the influencers?
That's a great question, and I did suspect in the case of chapter 2 on micro-influencers especially, as we were going through the data to validate the accounts, I did see some indications of like fake followers, because like the account had 500K followers, but like very few posts or very little engagement. So it might indeed influence the results. And another problem is that given the restrictions with CrowdTangle and data access, I couldn't collect like a longitudinal engagement. So I only had engagement at that point in time. So given the limitations, I couldn't really explore that. But if I had access to that overview, like over time, it's something that we could take into account by analyzing activity and like peaks in activity and so on. So given our sample, because it was manually created, I don't think in my data set it was significant. But indeed, like for scaling this, for taking more accounts into a data set, it's something to be addressed for sure.
Okay. Do you still have time?
Yes.
Okay, very good. So we saw in figures 2.1 and 5.1 like a decreasing trend after this year 2018, which is kind of interesting because we all know that this economy should be actually growing and not kind of shrinking. Is that because of the selection of your influencers?
Great question. So I think in this context here, it was around the time that Instagram stories were released. So I highlight on chapter 2 that it's mostly due to that, a shift in activity, like strategies, because CrowdTangle also didn't aggregate data on stories. So these are on this chapter 2 is focusing only on permanent posts. So a lot of that was changing the strategy from permanent posts to more stories, and also migration to other platforms, because we can see that maybe more 2019, but around that time, TikTok starts to become more popular. So might be an indication of migration to a different platform, which I didn't explore because I didn't collect TikTok data. But in this context here, I think it's mostly stories.
Okay. I think you also mentioned somewhere that this platform that you use for finding the influencers, the HeapSci, that bias may influence also your selection of the influencers. Can you explain more what you mean by that?
Yeah, so this is a platform that you can use to search for influencers. So how it works is you can select a country and select some criteria, like number of followers, number of comments, and so on, and then it gives you a list. So I think most bias comes from the relevance metric. So they sort the influencers somehow, and they're not transparent about it, but I didn't use it. I sorted by followers, and then we went through people who were collaborating with me in this paper. We went through the list and checked the influencers manually. So I think this mitigated many of the biases because we could make sure that the accounts match our criteria that we established for curating the influencers.
Okay, so finally.
Still have time.
Oh, wonderful. So Instagram and YouTube are very visual channels. So the most of the content is actually there. And I was wondering that since you focus only on the comments and the text, how much of these questions that you're addressing in your thesis could be actually kind of enforced or kind of understood better if you actually analyze also the video content and images that are shared?
Yes, that's a great point, especially now with TikTok, and platforms in general are moving to more short-form video content. But I still think in the context of my thesis for monetization, captions are very important, because the captions are where influencers tag the brand, add like the promotional hashtag, promotional links, and so on. So text is still very important. But indeed, I think now there's a shift to more the content itself, so the video itself. So I think analyzing that would give us more insight. But the problem, something to keep in mind, is the cost of that. So first, we don't have access to the data, but if we were to have access, using like multimodal, like vision LLMs and so on, would be much more expensive than like I use logistic regression sometimes, like simple models. So it does give us more insight, but we need to balance the cost. Otherwise, so we need to be very sure that it's clear that using more modalities would help us.
Yep. Okay. Maybe the final question, like a bigger question.
Yes.
So in social media, we know that Meta, for example, has this Advantage Plus framework, which is using basically large language models to help marketers and influencers probably also to include that content, add content into the messages and information. And also we have now this business that you are basically also representing, which is trying to build ad blockers. And they are also based on large language models. So how do you see this like this field where we are entering now, that we have a big language models creating content and other models detecting those and kind of battling for the souls of the audience?
It's indeed interesting. And I think people are using them indeed, like LLMs for generating content. But I still think that in the case of influencers, their authenticity is a big point. So they still want to have their brand, like their style. So I think it might be a tool that they use, but I still think that we won't replace them actually writing their posts for now. But I think what I do on chapter 3, especially 3.2 with synthetic data, with the metrics I propose, this can be helpful to detecting and analyzing such content. If it becomes more prevalent, I think these metrics can be helpful in detecting and analyzing it.
Okay, thank you very much for your answers.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Then the opposition will now be continued by Dr. Zanetu, who is an assistant professor at the Department of Multi-Actor Systems of Delft University.
Thanks for the talk. Your thesis was a super interesting read, and I really enjoyed reading your thesis. I have some questions mainly regarding the part your work about online toxicity. So in chapter 4, you create some datasets from YouTube and you release them back to the community, which is I commend you for these efforts. But I have a question about your methodology. So you are using there some classifiers that are trained on Twitter data, and you apply them on YouTube to basically score the content. But do you have any thoughts of how the differences between the platforms, like for example, you might have different audience or different lengths in the content, may affect the performance of the classifier when it's applied to YouTube versus Twitter?
Esteemed opponent, thank you for the kind words and the great question. So indeed in 4.2, so in the toxicity and gender, I use different pre-trained models, like for sentiment, hate speech, and so on. And most of them were trained on Twitter data. And this decision was basically because there were no models available in YouTube data, and I didn't have labeled data, so I couldn't fine-tune a model myself for these tasks. And I chose these ones because I think they were the most similar to what I had. So it's still social media, and still a similar kind of communication. And indeed, the major difference is that tweets are limited, like number of characters, and YouTube comments can be unrestricted. If there is a limit, it's very high. However, when analyzing the distribution of the length, it's actually very similar. So of course there are outliers on YouTube, but on average, they're very similar. And also the features that people use, like tags, tagging other people and using hashtags, they're less frequent on YouTube, but they still happen. So in that sense, I think that was the best alternative that I had. Of course, the best would be fine-tuning models on YouTube data, but given the restrictions, I think, in the analysis I did, I think it fit well enough. So I think the results are reliable.
But do you have any thoughts of whether the classifiers will perform similarly to the performance that is reported when applied on Twitter, or less?
That's a good question. I think less, of course, because a lot of, we wouldn't have as much vocabulary overlap. And especially how these data sets are collected. They're usually collected using like a specific topic or like specific hashtags, so they tend to be biased to that topic. And this is something I also observed on chapter 4, like my own data set. I saw that many of the abusive comments are relating to the specific topic of the video. So there are tokens that are like correlations. So definitely there will be a drop in performance. But I think given the similarity in the language and the style and the interactions on the platform, I think it's still good enough given the limitations.
Thank you. So I have another question about your data collection. So you focus on platforms like YouTube and Instagram to study problems like online toxicity. So these platforms, from their community guidelines, specifically prohibit, toxicity and hate speech on their platforms, and they enforce content moderation, meaning that they might remove contents that are toxic. So do you have any thoughts of, so your data collection is done post hoc, meaning that is done post moderation. So some things may have been removed even before you collected them. So do you have any sense of how this may affect the results that you have in the online toxicity part?
Yes, indeed. So it's after content moderation, and both content moderation by the platform itself, so probably automated content moderation, and YouTube, like the channels themselves might have moderators. But I think it's different. The first thing is that the guidelines are not, how they define what's removed from the platform are not the same as my framework. So it's different expressions of toxicity. I think the guidelines are more extreme, it's more like hate speech, more specific, while what I consider abusive language is broader. So it encapsulates more expressions of toxicity. And the results, where I compared my data set to other data sets in the literature and the prevalence of what I consider abusive and other data sets toxicity, the distribution is quite similar. So I think in that sense, the results are reliable, considering that a lot of, maybe the worst of toxicity has been removed, but it's comparable to other works, and I think it's good enough.
Do I have time for one final question? So with all the things that you know today, if you were going to start your PhD today, what would you have done different? Will you still study online toxicity, for example?
Oh, that's a great question. So I would still study online toxicity, but I think I would start from the perspective that I took on chapter 5. So chapter 5, I'm looking more at the incentives. So what's behind it? So chapter 4 is more about expression. So we see comments, targeted influencers, and I think that's important. But I think a more interesting direction is what I start doing on chapter 5, like when that is a strategy, when that's done on purpose, and how that affects social media, like how that propagates through followers and through other channels. And I think I would start from there, because I think it's more interesting and more complex and it's just interesting. Maybe I would start working with TikTok sooner, because it was getting popular back then, but the problem is the API was not available. It just became available last year in the EU. So given what I know now, and considering that the API would be available, I would do TikTok, because I think it's very interesting and it has significant differences from Instagram, even though, well, no, they are different. But I would add TikTok as another platform to do more comparative studies and focus more on the incentives behind the practice of influencers, both for toxicity and for, like, chapter 2, the disclosure practices.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. The opposition will now be continued by Dr. Nguyen, who is an assistant professor at the Department of Information and Computing Sciences of Utrecht University.
Thank you. Dear candidates, I really enjoyed reading your thesis. You had a breadth of experiments, very creative, and also I really liked how you mixed in different disciplines in your work. So in your thesis, you perform various machine learning experiments where you train classifiers to detect sponsored content, right? And one question that I had throughout reading this thesis, but also one that you actually highlighted in your presentation, is how do we know that these models really work, right? Because in natural language processing, many studies have found that sometimes models that seem to perform really well, they have really high performance, they're actually not really doing the task. They pick up on spurious correlations. And you also hint to this with phrasings like token, coincidence, etc. So I'd like to probe a little bit more in this topic. So could you maybe first reflect on potential spurious correlations that are present in your data or in your models?
Esteemed opponent, thank you for the kind words and the question. Indeed, so that's kind of the point of chapter 3, trying to improve that, to make sure the models work, make sure that the data is reliable, and that we can actually analyze whether they're working. And the problem is, I think it's not a matter of models. I think it's a matter of framing of the task. So what I do is just given a caption, is that an ad or not, is very limited. Because in the end, we don't know. Like, it's impossible to know if it's actually sponsored. Like, we would have to see a contract between the influencer and the brand. So the task is inherently impossible given what we have. So of course, the task would be more like, is this likely to be sponsored? So that would be a better framing. And still, we have a severe limitation of context. So for instance, when we see like, especially for micro-influencers, they might partner with smaller brands that are not so well known. So if we see the brand, we see the ad tag, we might not recognize it. So a person would, of course, could just click on that, see posts by that account, and know it's a brand, but we don't represent that with the machine learning models. So that's a problem. So more the task. And then about the correlations, I have a clear example. So there was one German influencer that posted, the majority of his ads were disclosed. So a lot of the data set was his content, and he always used a specific hashtag, like was his hashtag. Like whenever he posted something, he used that hashtag. And when I analyzed the feature importance of the n-grams, I could see that his hashtag was like top associated to the sponsor content class. And of course, it was just a coincidence just because of data imbalance. So these are things that happen very often. Also specific brands or, so we know that this is not generalizing, and it's a limitation of the data set. So to improve that, I would work on getting more representative, like bigger data sets, but also including adding more context to the task, both for annotation and for machine learning models.
All right. Okay, thanks. And then I had a question about the data set that you created where you annotated YouTube comments for abusive content using a 7-point liked scale. So this is interesting because a lot of work in natural language processing uses kind of this binary operationalization, right? But actually then you didn't really reflect on why you decided on using such a scale. And you even say that the implications of using such a scale versus a binary classification is something that future work should look at. So I also like to hear more about this from you. So for example, given a legal context, you often have, or you often need some kind of binary decision, I guess, right? Is it legal or illegal, or is it violating a certain rule? So how does that work when you use like a multi-point scale, right? What are the benefits of using a scale if in the end you're interested in a legal setting?
That's a great question, and maybe this is one thing I would do differently if I had more time. I would investigate that in more detail. So that decision was exactly about uncertainty, and actually I don't think in this context, like for a legal decision, it's not binary, considering the framing of the task, again, lack of context. So this was a way to mitigate the lack of context. So if annotators felt they were uncertain, so this was a mix of certainty and intensity, so I mentioned that on chapter 4. And it's something we decided together with the annotators. So the annotation process there was very interactive. So we talked to the annotators, we had multiple rounds of training, we discussed the annotation and the framework and refined it. And this was a solution we came up with to represent exactly the complexity and uncertainty of the decision. And then when I do the experiments, I just binarize it, right? So I do like 4, greater than 4, it's abusive, and lower, it's not abusive. Because I didn't really have the time to investigate that further. But I think it's an interesting way of addressing that complexity without changing the framing of the task too much.
All right, thanks. Do you have time for, yes? I have another follow-up question. So, so the task of annotating abuse content is very difficult, right, to get good agreement. And also many people say it's inherently a subjective task to some extent. Even if you train annotators for a very long time, they might generally disagree about whether it's abusive content or not. So could you reflect on the subjectivity of the task and how that fits into kind of your modeling and also this legal context? Because there are also other researchers in NLP that now take this different perspective where they say we want the model to represent all these different perspectives, these basically the distributions of annotations, while you seem to still aim for this kind of high agreement and basically getting rid of subjectivity, right? So could you maybe reflect on this?
Yes. So I think that the Likert scale was a bit subjectivity, but I agree that it is just inherently ambiguous. But in this case, especially for 4.1, the abusive language, we had a very specific framework. Although it was the instructions themselves were a bit abstract, the training process and considering the legal background of the annotators and the instructions and so on, our expectation was that they had this decision making. Their decision making was was relying on their legal background. So we were not trying to directly operationalize laws. So it wasn't supposed to be a binary thing, but we hope that some concepts will be less subjective for them given their legal training. So for instance, one of the instructions was like, does it incite hatred? So for them, they would have more context about what that means. So I acknowledge that there's still subjectivity, but I think given the process, how the framework was built and how the process with the annotators and training and so on, and the scale, I think we handled that in a good way.
We have time for another question, or we can move on.
Just we move on to the next person.
Thank you.
So thank you very much. The opposition will now be continued by Professor Tintarev, who is a professor of explainable AI at the Department of Advanced Computing Sciences of this university, and she's also the chair of the assessment committee.
Dear candidate, at the risk of being redundant, I would also like to congratulate you and thank you for a well-written thesis. I particularly enjoyed the long discussion chapters that in themselves had experiments delving deeper into the questions that you posed. Of course, working in explainable AI, I was reading with particular interest the chapter on explanations. But my question there is one of a more machine learning nature. You struggled with class imbalance, as we often do in machine learning, and you undersampled and then realized you also had to fix the limited data. Dr. Herma was already talking about the issue of false positives as a bias that gets introduced in this kind of augmentation. But I would like to hear your reflections on other biases that might have been introduced, with the full nuance, of course, that there is no situation that is unbiased, but you have these different prompts, these different few-shot learning protocols. What might have been inadvertently introduced in the process?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for the kind words and the question. So you were referring to the synthetic data generation, or chapter 3 as a whole?
Yeah, the synthetic generation of explanations. Yeah.
Yeah, so I tried different prompting strategies, and each time I generated a set of polls, I sampled different examples. So of course it was random from the total distribution. So I think the main source of bias there would be the distribution itself, so the real data set. And of course it's not representative sample. It was from the same data set from chapter 2, so those influencers and all the bias, the potential biases I discussed there apply. So one thing is that it's just a matter of accessibility. We cannot sample from the entire population of Instagram influencers. So we are taking from the ones that are on the platform Hipsy, the platform I used. And we cannot be sure who is there, who is included in there, who are we missing. So indeed that's a problem. And it's something we could mitigate by not only having more data, but having more well-informed data. So sample from specific populations, specific communities, or specific niches of content to make sure the data we generate from those are more representative, knowing well that we cannot be fully representative given the limitations of. So it's more about selecting well-informed data samples.
Thank you for the answer, and I think it is particularly relevant knowing that these systems tend to have factors of mode collapse where there's anyway a probabilistic bias, right? So you have to actively counteract it continuously. My second question actually came from following the other line of questioning, which has to do with the moderation policies of different platforms. To some extent, they are well, not transparent, but not utterly opaque, in that when there is a big change in moderation policy, that tends to be publicized. And you do have snapshots, yes, but over a slightly longer duration. How do you think the changes in the content moderation policies during the course of your dissertation have influenced different disclosure strategies or methods that occurred, and how that, of course, influences your results?
That's a great question. I think in the context of disclosures, I think there are changes even in platform features, like for instance, the introduction of the paid partnership tag. So it provided influencers a new way to disclose content. So that's a big change. But more specifically on content.
Thales Bertaglia, the time appointed for defending your thesis has passed. The degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and your defense. I request that you and your company await our return in this room for the results of our deliberations.
Thank you.
Please all rise.
The PhD defense has now ended. The degree committee will debate the candidate's performance behind closed doors. This process usually takes about 10 minutes.
Long road to the south side. 10 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and that. The line, I know you know that I can't read your mind. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. Cause I'll go the extra mile. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and that. On the dash, got my laces tied. Long road, I don't waste no time. Break rules because fate decides. With the team and we chase the light. I make a move, fall down, shake it off. I hate to lose, bad branch, break it off. No room for negativity, praise and love. Prepare for deep part cause we're taking off. Hit the mileage, traveling so far from home. Gathering knowledge, other connections. I put the time in to get everything I ever hoped for. It's a challenge and we all in. It's a better future that we go for. And even though these nights seem long, I know that I am never on my own. Know you've won the battle once you've grown. South side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and that. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and that. On the line, I know you know that I can't read your mind. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. Cause I'll go the extra mile.
Thales Bertaglia, the degree committee here present has assessed the quality of your thesis and your defense. In view of its positive verdict and taking into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Professor Jamnitsky is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom. I invite your supervisor to now take the floor.
Please all rise.
Do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible?
Yes, I promise.
By the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present, I hereby confer upon you, Thales Felipe Costa Bertaglia, the degree of doctor and grant you all rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, I now present you with a degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary, and the other members of the committee, and affixed with the official seal of the university.
Please be seated.
Dear Thales, when you joined the university in early 2020, right before COVID hit, and when I joined the university almost 2 years later, we had no idea we were to work together. The fact that I found you here with the solid technical expertise expected from a PhD candidate in computational sciences and with interdisciplinary background that combined legal frameworks and social theories was a lucky happenstance. In addition to your skills, you also came with a wonderful co-supervisor who became a great research collaborator and friend. It's such wrinkles of destiny that we can be grateful for, but we can never rely on when you plan our careers and lives. For a while, we loved deadlines in the way of Douglas Adams. We loved the sound deadlines made as they passed by. When you finally accepted that you in fact can write and have something meaningful to say, there was nothing stopping you. That paper that got submitted and made it to a top conference while I was camping in the Ardennes should be the standard criterion for judging when a PhD candidate is ready to defend. It's when ideas are mature enough to flow into a paper with all the figures and tables and the well-written captions in place. My role was mainly to show you that you can. I am very happy you were my first PhD supervisee here. You set the high bar of friendly collaborative productivity. I congratulate you for arriving at this point, and I never for one moment doubted it. I also want to acknowledge your friends and family who made this journey more bearable, with cookies, laughter, and coffee, and parties all mattered. I'm looking forward to more collaborations together, and I'm looking forward to seeing the great things you will achieve. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Dear Dr. Bertaglia, also on behalf of Maastricht University, I congratulate you with the doctorate degree that you have just required. My congratulations also go to your supervisors, your family, and your friends. Now, before I close this meeting, I would like to thank all members of the degree committee, and especially those coming from far. Your participation is much appreciated, no matter whether on-site or online. What's next? After closing this meeting, we will all go to the reception in the refectory elsewhere in this building, where everyone can congratulate the new doctor. However, before we do so, we will use the opportunity to take some pictures with the candidate and the full degree committee, including our online members. But first, before we close the internet connection, let me offer our online members the opportunity to congratulate our candidate. Professor Aletras, maybe? Can you switch on the sound?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, now we can hear you.
All right, yeah, perfect. Thales, congratulations. All the best to the next step of your career. I really enjoyed your thesis and hope you do the best and many more papers and citations in the future.
Thank you.
Okay. Professor Weiss?
Dear Thales, congratulations also from my side. I really enjoyed reading your thesis. I enjoyed your presentation and the way you answered all the questions. So well done, and I wish you good luck for whatever is expecting you scientifically now.
Thank you.
Okay. So thank you all very much for attending this milestone event for Thales Bertaglia. I now close this academic meeting and we move to the picture session.